This morning, I'd like to talk about something that every single one of us has to deal with, and that is temptation. Temptation. When Job in the Old Testament was going through all of his trials, and he lost his wealth, he lost his family, everyone, all of his kids except for his wife, and finally he even lost his health. As he sat there in the ashes and scraped his sores, he bemoaned and he said, if only there was someone who could be a mediator between me and God, someone who could speak to God on my behalf. And I think what is tremendously amazing is that God gave us that mediator that Job was asking for in Jesus. In James, it says that God cannot be tempted, nor does he tempt anyone else to sin. But in Hebrews, we're told that Jesus was tempted in all ways as we are, yet was without sin. And because of that, he is able to be a sympathetic and understanding high priest as he mediates for us to God the Father. So, is the Bible right in one place and wrong in another? Is it right in James where it says that Jesus was tempted in all ways as we are, yet was without sin, but wrong in James where it says that God can't be tempted? I think that there is something about the incarnation of Jesus, him taking on human form, that allowed him to experience what it's like to be tempted. The only difference is he didn't submit to the temptation like each and every one of us has. And because he never sinned, he's able to be that sacrifice and that mediator to God on our behalf. This morning, I'd like to look at temptation. There are three things that I'd like to bring out. And the first is this: the reality of temptation. The reality of temptation. Every single one of us is going to face it. In James 1, verses 12 through 15, it says this: when people are tempted and still continue strong, they should be happy. After they have proved their faith, God will reward them with life forever. God promised this to all those who love him. When people are tempted, they should not say, God is tempting me. Evil cannot tempt God, and God himself does not tempt anyone. But people are tempted when their own evil desires leads them away and traps them. This desire leads to sin, and when sin grows and brings death. You know, in James 1, where he says, my brothers, consider it all trials when various temptations, consider it all joy when various temptations and trials come upon you, knowing that it develops endurance or perseverance. To me, when I've read that verse, it always just seems like it makes about as much sense as saying, if you lean into a punch, it'll hurt less. You know, who in their right mind would look forward to trials and temptations? Well, I don't think that's exactly what James is saying there. James is saying not that we should look forward to the temptations, not that we should look forward to the trials, but we should look forward to the results that those trials and those temptations bring. Some of you are maybe old enough to remember the old comic books. Did any of you ever read the comic books when you were little? And they had the ads in them, and you see the really skinny guy that gets sand kicked on him at the beach. I see a couple of heads nodding, you remember, right? And then he goes to the gym or whatever it is, and he's big and strong and burly, and he chases off the guy who was kicking sand on him when he was younger, right? Well, in in James, it's like what he is saying is that we don't look forward necessarily to the trials and the temptations, but we look forward to the end result. What those temptations bring us, that they make us stronger, that they make us better as a result of having gone through them. The reality is this: Jesus was tempted. In Matthew 4, 1 through 11, that's brought out. But what I want to do is go rather to, in Matthew 4, we see the temptation of Jesus where he's tempted with 3 separate temptations, right? He's tempted to turn the bread or the stones to bread. He's tempted to float down from the top of the temple. And we see those temptations that he's tempted with. But I want to go to a different passage. I want to go to Hebrews 4, verses 14 through 16. And I want to read what it says there in the New Century Version. It says this: "Since we have a great high priest, Jesus, the Son of God, who has gone into heaven, let us hold on to the faith that we have. For our high priest is able to understand our weaknesses. When he lived on earth, he was tempted in every way that we are, but he did not sin. Let us then feel very sure that we can come before God's throne where there is grace. There we can receive mercy and grace to help us when we need it." The book of Hebrews was written to Jewish people to encourage them to not give up on their faith. And so we see in Hebrews where they're told that Jesus is superior to angels, and that he's superior to Moses, and that he's superior to the law. And as we go through each of these things, the author stops and then encourages them not to give up on their faith. And this is one of those encouragements that we find there. And the author tells us that we have a high priest, Jesus, who is able to understand our weaknesses because he was tempted just as we are. If Jesus was tempted, don't you think we will be too? We will be tempted too. In James 1:12 it says, "When people are tempted and still continue strong, they should be happy. After they have proved their faith, God will reward them with life forever." God promised this to all those who love him. You know, there are people who doubt God, who doubt the existence of God, who doubt Christianity. And the reasoning for that is this: if God is this loving God, how can he allow evil to exist in our world? We say that God is this great loving God. And then we look around us and we see the hate and the evil and the wickedness in our world. And there are people who say, well, if that's true, how can God exist? The reality is this, is that God in his wisdom chose to give mankind, men and women, free will. By giving them free will, there is the possibility that they will choose not to follow him. When I was younger, in the mall, we had a Baskin Robbins. 31 different flavors of ice cream. And you could go in there and they had these little tiny pink plastic spoons, right? And you could say, I'd like to try that one. Or I'd like to try this one here. And there was 31 different flavors for you to choose from. Imagine what it would be like to go into Baskin Robbins and all they have is vanilla ice cream. If God took away our choice, if God took away our free will, it would be like going into Baskin Robbins and having vanilla, only choice being vanilla ice cream. In other words, if there wasn't the potential to do evil, you would have no choice. All you could choose was vanilla ice cream. And so God, because of who He is, because God wants us to choose Him, there is the potential that we will make another choice. And that choice is that we will not choose Him. The problem is that when people choose not to follow God or to obey Him and His wishes, bad things happen. The reality is this, is that God has done something about evil in the world. God is presently doing something about evil in the world. And in the future, God will remove the evil from our world entirely. God did something in the past about the evil in our world when He sent His Son Jesus into the world to die for our sins. God is doing something about evil in the world because He intends for His people to make the world a better place. And God will do something about evil in the world in the future when Jesus comes again and He removes all evil from it. He will judge the world, and those who are righteous, those who have chosen the gift of salvation that God so freely offers through Jesus, will spend eternity with Him, and those who have rejected Him will spend the rest of eternity separated from Him in the lake of fire. That's the reality. The problem is that in the here and now, sometimes people choose to do bad things, and we bear the consequences of those decisions. All of us will be tempted. The second thing that we can see is the result of temptation. The result of temptation. If we succeed, we will be spiritually better and stronger than we were before. In James 1, 2 through 4, it says this, Dear brothers and sisters, whenever trouble comes your way, let it be an opportunity for joy. For when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be strong in character and ready for anything. Here's the reality. It isn't the good times that make us strong, that put the steel in our spine and make us who we are. It's the bad times that do that. The struggles that make us stronger people. I'm not a farmer, but I've been told that the outside rows of corn, their root system is the strongest because it has to deal with the wind and the weather much more so than the corn that's in the interior of the field. Now, I don't know for sure if that's true or not, but I do know that it is the struggles in life that define us and make us who we are. If it hadn't been for World War II, Winston Churchill would have been a good prime minister. But because of World War II, Winston Churchill was a great prime minister because it forced him to step out of his comfort zone and become the prime minister that he became. The same thing is true for us. It is the trials and the temptations of this life that make us strong and define who we are, not the good times. I think that's part of the reason that you see this deep-knit camaraderie among those who have served in the military together. It's because they've gone through this shared trial. The shared trial of boot camp, the shared trial of war. And many times those men and women who have been through that remain friends even when they're separated for the rest of their lives. This idea of shared trial. It is our trials that make us stronger. In James 1:12 through 13, it says this: God blesses the people who patiently endure testing. Afterward, they will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. And remember, no one who wants to do wrong should ever say, God is tempting me. God is never tempted to do wrong, and he never tempts anyone else either. So if we succeed when the testing comes, we become stronger, better people. If we fail when the trials come, we sin and we travel down the road toward death. James 1:14 through 16 says, temptation comes from the lure of our own evil desires. These evil desires lead to evil actions, and evil actions lead to death. So don't be misled, my dear brothers and sisters. James here says that the temptation comes from our own propensity to sin, from the lure of our own evil desires. You know, when I was younger, I really believed that people were genuinely, naturally good, and then we became corrupted as life went on. The older I get, I'm not as sure about that. But it is true that as we are tempted by life, that if we're not careful, it will lead us down a path that we do not want to go. I'm not here to tell you this morning that there's no pleasure in sin. If there was no pleasure in sin, nobody would do it. If every time you sinned, you were hit with 200 volts of electricity, you'd stop doing it, right? But the problem is that sin seems great at the beginning, but in the end it leads us into horrible, horrible problems. The alcoholic that took the first drink thought that it was wonderful, but never dreamed that it would leave him homeless and penniless in the gutter. The guy that went to the casino and wanted to gamble and have a good time never realized that it might lead him to the place where he is bankrupt and penniless and begging family members for money. You see, the problem is we don't see the end result of sin. We only see the enticing that comes at the beginning. And James warns us that the end result of sin is never, ever what we want. You know, I preached a sermon about sin, and there was 3 points to the sin. And the one point was sin will always promise more than it can deliver. And the final point is that sin will always cost you more than you're willing to pay. And we can look at example after example after example in the Bible. We can look at Samson, for example. Samson saw this beautiful woman, Delilah, right? Except that God had said that the Israelite people were not to intermarry among the Canaanite people because God knew that it would lead them into sin. Samson didn't pay attention to God's warning in Scripture. And where did it lead him? It leaded him to being blind, grinding wheat like an oxen, or, and it ended up costing him his life. Do you think that when Samson looked at Delilah, he said to himself, man, this is going to cost me my life? No. And that's the way sin is. If we submit to sin, it will always lead us into trouble. And then thirdly and finally, how do we deal with temptation? We know we're all going to face it. We know that if we submit to it, that's not going to end well for us. So how do we deal with it? Well, first, realize that the devil can't make you do it. The devil can't make you do it. I know you've heard otherwise. You've heard people say the devil made me do it, but it's just not true. 1 Corinthians 10:13 is a verse that every one of us should have memorized. And it says this, no temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful and will not allow you to be tempted beyond which you are able. But with the temptation, God will provide a way of escape also, that you may be able to endure it. 1 Corinthians 10:13. That verse is a promise for Christian people that God will never allow you to be tempted with something that you cannot say no to. It's a promise. But in there's also a warning. Because he says, but with the temptation, God will provide a way of escape also, that you may be able to endure it. If you ignore the way out, you may find yourself in trouble. Maybe you you're trying to lose weight. Okay, maybe this is not a sin, but I'm going to use this illustration anyway. And your wife has baked this amazing cake, and she says, Dan, don't eat the cake. It's for church later, right? And you're looking at the cake, and the cake just looks amazing. And you're hungry, right? And so you get the knife, and you're getting ready to cut the cake, and you get a phone call. And the phone call is somebody reminding you about the dinner that's later that night, right? That might be your way of escape. That might just be that way, that escape that God is providing you to avoid the temptation that you know that you're not supposed to do. Maybe when you were younger, you were tempted to take something that didn't belong to you. And just when you were struggling with that temptation, maybe it was at school, maybe it was to take an eraser that didn't belong to you, and the teacher comes up to you and says, hi, how are you doing? Maybe that was that way of escape that God was providing for you. You see, there's a promise for Christian people that God will never allow you to be tempted with something that you can't say no to. Remember that the devil can't make you do it. Secondly, avoid situations where you know that you're going to be tempted. Avoid those places or those situations where you know that you're going to be tempted. In Matthew 5:27-30, it says this, you have heard that it was said, you must not be guilty of adultery. But I tell you that if anyone looks at a woman and wants to sin sexually with her, in his mind, he has already done that sin with that woman. If your right eye causes you to sin, take it out and throw it away. It is better to lose one part of your body than to have your whole body thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, is Jesus telling you to dismember your body? I don't think so. Okay? He's not saying that you should poke out your eyeballs or cut off your hands. What he's saying is to remove yourself from the temptation. If you are an alcoholic, don't be going to the bar, right? If you are addicted to gambling, don't go to Meskwaki. Don't put yourself into situations where you know that you are going to be tempted. If you know that you are going to say unkind, mean, hurtful things about somebody, you probably should avoid them, right? Don't put yourself in situations where you know that you are going to be tempted. It only makes sense. And then third, pray that God will say no when the devil asks to tempt you. Pray that God will say no when the devil asks to tempt you. Do you remember, we talked a little bit about Job. In Job 1, 8 through 11, it says this, New Century Version. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him. He is honest and innocent. He's a man honoring God and staying away from evil. But Satan answered the Lord, Job honors God for good reason. You have put a wall around him, his family, and everything that he owns. You have blessed the things that he has done. His flocks and herds are so large, they almost cover the land. But reach out your hand and destroy everything he has, and he will curse you to your face. You remember in the story of Job, Job specifically asked for permission to tempt Job, and that permission was granted. Now, there were some limitations that were placed on the devil. To begin with, the devil was not allowed to touch Job physically. He was not allowed to affect his health, right? And he was not allowed to kill Job. And so later when he goes back and Job still hasn't cursed God, the devil says, well, yeah, but if you let me take his health away, then he'll curse you, right? And so then God grants him permission to take Job's health. Do you notice that in that story, the devil sought permission, specific permission, to tempt Job, and that permission was granted? You might be thinking to yourself, yeah, well, Dan, but that's in the Old Testament, and that doesn't really apply to everyday life. I would submit to you in the Gospels where Jesus says to Peter, Peter, the devil has requested to sift you as wheat, but when you have returned, strengthen your brothers. In other words, Jesus is telling Peter specifically that the devil has asked for permission specifically to tempt Peter, and that permission has been granted. Let me just go to one other place if you doubt me. Do you remember the Lord's Prayer? Right? We've all memorized it. There's this one part in the Lord's Prayer that we recite, but we don't often think about. It says this, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the New Century Version, it says this, Matthew 6:13, and do not cause us to be tempted, but save us from the evil one. Let me give you Dan's paraphrase of that verse. God, when the devil asks to tempt me, just say no. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. God, when the devil asks to tempt me, just say no. You see, even in the model prayer, Jesus encourages us to have God say no when the devil asks to tempt us. There are things that we can do to help make the temptation less. Do you remember when you were little, or maybe as parents when you had young kids. And you're driving in the car and the kids are fighting and bickering, or they're arguing amongst themselves, or they're being loud or noisy. And you said to the kids, let's play this game. Let's see who can be the quietest. I'm sure that our family is the only one who ever did that, right? Let's see who can be the quietest. And when they're little, that works, right? For a little while. Until they get older and they realize that they don't want to play that game. And then when you say, well, let's see who can be the quietest, somebody almost before you get the question out says, I lose, right? Because they know that that's a game that they don't want to play. I'm here to submit to you that the greatest cure for temptation is to be able to come to the realization that that's a game that you don't want to play. And the only way that that really, really happens is by making your relationship with Jesus so real that you don't want to play the games that the devil has to offer. That's the real solution. And that's the one I want to encourage you to seek after this morning. Temptation will come to every one of us, but you don't have to submit to it.